think it might help me with some sources a little bit. Look wiser than my years. Yeah.
All right, we are live actually, despite our bantering. It is the Prospect Weekly Roundup. I'm David Dayen, the executive editor of the American Prospect, and with me is Luke Goldstein, writing fellow with the Prospect. How you doing, Luke?
Hey, hey. Good. Good to be back on.
All right, and maybe we'll just sort of break some news here at the top of the show. This will be probably the last time we have you on the Prospect Weekly Roundup, Luke, because uh, Luke's 2 years as a writing fellow are up, and he's moving on. Happy to say, sad to say, I'm not happy he's moving. I'm happy.
You can
I'm
be
happy to
happy.
know that he's moving
It's
to
fine.
gainful employment. I'm not happy that he's moving because he was excellent for us. I was going to say nicer stuff before you were a couple minutes late, but you know, I'll put that aside. Luke was a tremendous asset to the organization for the last 2 years. Did some really incredible work. Great to see him develop as a writer and a real voice in this country. And Luke, we want to thank you so much for all the work, hard work that you did here for the Prospect.
Yeah, no, I'm extremely appreciative. It's been a great run for the last 2 years. And this is the last anyone will hear from me,
This is,
maybe ever.
well, I
I guess I'm
look.
disinvited from the show moving forward.
I'm not saying you're disinvited, and I don't want to step on. If you want to tell the people to find you next, you're welcome to do
Yeah.
that. But that's your decision.
Yeah, so I'm going to be writing for the Lever, which is another sort of more investigative news focused outlet. Politics, policy, similar kind of ecosystem. So you can find me over there. And yeah, a lot of
Levernews.com.
coverage
All
to come.
right.
Yeah.
They're friends of the Prospect at the Lever, and it'll be great to see you over there. And can't wait to see what you do in the next phase of your career. But let's, for the moment, ratchet it back and start talking about what we've been doing at the Prospect and what's been going on. Because obviously, this I think was a pivotal week. It kind of reminded me of well, really the first week of the Trump administration 8 years ago, where Democrats were. It's not really well remembered because you think of the resistance and this sort of immediate pushback to Donald Trump as a historically aberrant president, but Democrats were kind of in the same position that they are at the beginning of this uh, uh, term in office. They were kind of wondering what their role was, moving to that sort of default position of thinking that everything that they believe is hated by by the public, and wanting to work with Trump. I very well remember Chuck Schumer talking about all the infrastructure projects that he wanted to get done in association with Donald Trump. And there were other statements like that. It wasn't until there was a triggering event that really snapped Democrats out of it and realized, oh, if we just oppose, like we can actually make progress here. And it was the Muslim ban. It was the attempt to keep all individuals coming from certain Muslim nations out of the country as a part of a travel ban. And I happen to remember I was actually coming back to LAX on a flight when that hit. And if you know about LAX, I was coming back on American Airlines, and the international terminal is next to the American Airlines terminal in LAX. So, and all of the activity, there had started to be protests at the airport, and it was happening at the international Tom Bradley International Terminal. And so I literally just walked over to participate and cover that protest. And I think I was the only person there with a bag like that was just sort of holding a sign with a bag. So um, uh, that was a moment that sort of snapped Democrats out of it and said, made them realize they were the actual opposition party. And we saw that this week too. And we saw that this week with the attempt to put a payment pause on all federal grants and loans. That was the real snap out of it event that made Democrats realize, hey, that might be unpopular if you get rid of, if you pause or stop funding every single grant and loan in the country, because the implications of that are massive.
Right. And maybe a news conference tomorrow, the day after, will help us get the word out. They were a little delayed on it. But yeah, I
Well,
think
yeah, I mean, it
snap of that.
wasn't, I'm not saying it was perfect, but eventually
Right.
the pushback, and, not all of it came from Democrats, some of it came from the media and whatnot, but the pushback was enough that within 48 hours, that order was rescinded.
Right.
And I think it was a moment where Democrats began to find their voice as uh, you know, being a, being opposed to the kinds of things, the kinds of harms that would ensue with this kind of extreme change in priorities. Because the next time that this is attempted, it's not just going to be an unconstitutional pause, right? There is a concerted effort to change policies, to cut Medicaid, to cut food stamp benefits, to cut these kinds of things in order to make room for tax cuts.
Right.
And so that is not going to be sort of this mass chaos where you flip a switch and all these things go off. It's going to be a very deliberate effort through Congress. And Democrats now have sort of a roadmap to how they handle that.
Right. No, certainly. So I think that maybe it would be helpful just to frame that. So, I haven't been directly reporting on the funding freezes this week. I've been working on other stuff, but we'll get to later. So
Yeah.
I've just been following, the reporting that's coming out somewhat as a layman. And I think maybe one area here that you can kind of shed light on is,
Mhm.
I'm following I'm following these memos that are coming out from OMB and then the backtracking and then the quarter and it's you're right that for me it kind of brought back memories of what happened with the travel ban where the White House
What
did
were you in
this.
elementary school when the travel ban came down? What
I,
memories?
I was actually at the airport at the same time because
You were also at the airport?
I was flying out to go back to school for the new
Uh-huh.
semester. I think that's right. But
Right.
I actually remember that too. But my point being that the White House did something that was just like flagrantly, illegal, like a
Yeah.
ban seemingly based on, religion. And it would seem to be the same with this, funding freeze. But it seems like there's not purely, or there is chaos, right? And disorder. But underneath that, there is this more kind of devious plan and
Yes.
legal theory that's going on. And these two things are, kind of happening at once and are sort of interrelated. So, maybe it is helpful to go through like the timeline of what
Great.
happened this week. But yeah, we can get to that.
That's great because it's super important. It's a great question because the seeds of this actually go back to the first Trump term.
Right.
So during the first Trump administration, at least in the second half of it, the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, was in the hands of a guy named Russell Vought. And he was the director, and the general counsel was a guy named Mark Paletta. And we know Mark Paletta is sort of in the popular political imagination because if you remember the Harlan Crow oil painting that shows Clarence Thomas holding court at one of billionaire mega donor Harlan Crow's resorts, where Thomas would take these luxury vacations that he
Yeah.
didn't actually list on his ethics forms.
Seared into
Mark
my mind. Yeah.
Yeah. So that oil painting, Mark Paletta is in it. He's sitting next to Clarence Thomas. He's his good buddy. He helped actually get through the Clarence Thomas nomination in 1991 during the first Bush administration. He co-authored or co-edited Clarence Thomas's autobiography. He was the counsel for Ginny Thomas during the January 6th Commission when she was asked to testify. So he is a longtime sort of
Right.
consigliere of Clarence Thomas's.
Almost
And
like a right hand man,
he
wouldn't you say?
was.
Yeah.
He was. And he, at that, in the first Trump term and in the new Trump term, because he was just announced this in the last week, he was the general counsel of OMB. And so you have Vaught and Paletta at OMB. And during the first Trump term, they repeatedly tried to rescind spending, tried to delay spending that was duly appropriated by Congress with the intention of having it all be spent. The first Trump impeachment was about his delaying for 55 days of spending on foreign aid to Ukraine in an attempt to sort of blackmail the president of Ukraine to
Right.
get him to investigate Joe Biden. So these fights were happening back then. They weren't happening in as sort of widespread a way as we saw this week with the funding pause on grants and loans, but they were happening in specific ways. And I reported this week on a letter that Paletta and Vaught wrote on the last day of the first Trump administration. This was January 19th, 2021, 4 years ago. They wrote a letter in response to a House Budget Committee sort of timeline of all the times that they believed OMB was violating spending laws, and all the times the Government Accountability Office backed up the case that these laws were being violated. And so this 14-page letter from Trump's OMB guys said, everything we are doing is perfectly legal. None of it is unconstitutional in any way. None of it violates the Impoundment Control Act, and we can talk about that in
Yeah.
a second. And indeed, the Impoundment Control Act is unworkable and should be removed and repealed. Now, what is the Impoundment Control Act? Well, there were times in sort of the early days of America where when Congress would make appropriations, it would say, hey, spend up to this dollar amount. In other words, it would give the sort of leeway to the president to not spend all of that. That gradually changed. And most appropriations today, almost all of them, say specifically, you must spend X amount of dollars. During the 1970s, Richard Nixon decided to test that theory. He would rescind spending. He would decide, I don't like that law, so I'm not going to spend on it. And as a result, Congress fought back, trying to protect its own power of the purse by passing a thing called the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, which passed so overwhelmingly. By the way, Joe Biden, a young freshman senator, voted for the
Wow.
Impoundment Control Act. That's how long ago
Yeah.
it was. Um, but it passed so overwhelmingly that Nixon signed it because he knew it would have been overridden by his veto if he vetoed. So the Impoundment Control Act says you cannot impound spending. That's sort of the technical term. You, the president, cannot pick and choose what you're going to spend money on, what you aren't. You can say, I want to rescind this spending or I want to delay this spending, but we're going to set up very specific structures for you to do that. If you want to rescind spending, you have to give us a special list of what you want to rescind and why, and then Congress decides whether or not to agree with that. So that's one part of the Impoundment Control Act. And the second part is, if you want to delay spending, you can do it, but you can only do it for these specific reasons, which are really around efficiency, or if another law says that you're allowed to rescind the spending. And you have to give us a special notice that says, this is why I'm delaying the spending. And there's a 45-day limit to that. So you put those two things together. Neither of those things have anything to do with what we saw this week, which was a blanket pause without a message to Congress. It was based on policy reasons, specifically because it said we are pausing the spending to see if it complies with Trump's executive orders, which is not an applicable way of deleting spending. And so this was sort of preparatory to an illegal impoundment that violates that federal law,
Right.
violates Supreme Court rulings, and violates the Constitution in terms of the Congress having the power of the
Yeah.
purse.
And just to kind of to draw out all the many the dynamics at play here, it seems fairly clear now from what's been reported that after that first OMB memo went out, that essentially was just a blanket freeze on trillions of dollars of government funding. They then followed that up by sort of trying to walk it back without doing so by saying, no, it's just the funding that relates to these specific executive orders that Trump signed on more or less, kind of
Well, I
DEI.
mean, the executive orders were mentioned in the initial document, in the
Right.
initial memo. So that was the reason, that was sort of the rationale given for the broad freeze, saying we have to check all of these programs to make sure they comply with these executive orders. That is an illegal way of doing delaying spending,
Yeah.
to be clear. Now, okay, so 4 years ago, let me just
Yeah.
wrap
Yeah.
this up here. So 4 years ago, Paletta and Russell Vought make this claim. Uh, the Biden administration happens. Russell Vought starts this organization called the Center for Renewing America, where he goes even further and in multiple papers, often written with Mark Paletta, he says the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional, and we should fight that, and the Supreme Court should favorably look upon us. That presidents have inherent authority to cancel spending is essentially what he's saying, which would be a radical reinterpretation of the Constitution, to be
Because of
very
like
clear.
English common law, right? This is basically
It
like
starts
drawing
all
back
the way
everything.
back there.
Yeah.
Starts all the way back with English common law, mentions things like going back to Thomas Jefferson when the rules were different, when Congress was saying spend up to this level. Mentions other impoundments without saying that they were challenged in court and the president lost.
Even before
Just
the
like
70,
neglecting.
right. Even
Yeah,
before
even
the
before
Nixon
this.
Impoundment Act, right. There's
That's right.
precedent going back even further. Yeah.
That's correct. So, second Trump term comes around. He nominates Russell Vought to be OMB director. He hires Mark Paletta to be the general counsel. And so all of this is setting up to pick a fight over impoundment. They are trying to force a challenge so that the Supreme Court has to decide on what they want, to get them to say, yes, the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional and presidents have this authority to limit spending if they want. This obviously would be a complete reinterpretation of the Constitution, and I would argue it would delete Congress as a player in the not just the budget, but really everything.
No more
If you
power
think
of the
about it,
purse.
yeah,
You
and
basically
and
get to
that
send
is
white papers to the White
and
House.
it's such a fundamental power, right? Because how could any Congress make a budget deal with the president? The president obviously has power in the budget because he can sign it or veto it. So the president already has leverage in any kind of budgetary debate, in any kind of appropriations debate, which goes back, pretty much everything Congress passes spends money in one way or another. And eventually that money has to be appropriated. So it's not just sort of the budget that is implicated by this, but really everything Congress does. And presidents already have the authority to manage that process a little bit through the leverage that they have through whether or not to pass or veto a budget. But what this is saying is, go ahead, Congress, pass whatever you want. But if I don't like the bill, I don't like the law, even if I sign it, I don't have to spend money on it. I mean, that's really the end of Congress. That turns Congress into a vestigial organ, as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
And so this is a really fundamental fight. And what was done with this grant pause was intended to pick that fight, but it was so so unpopular and so sweeping that they had to roll it back.
Well,
But that
and
doesn't mean this fight is over.
and that what I was going to say earlier is that Rusvat has not, or at the time when they walked this back, has not been confirmed yet, actually, as the
Right.
director of OMB, which seems to maybe have been one of the dynamics for when they started trying to walk back parts of the initial
Well,
OMB.
and
It might be kind of an political issue.
it was even crazier that when Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, was asked about this, she actually said, "Well, if a nonprofit or a recipient of a grant or a loan wants to say that they are complying with Trump's executive orders, they should take that up with Russ Vought." And she said that at the time when he
Yeah.
was not an officer of the federal government. He was just a private citizen as a nominee for OMB. So this is
Yeah.
absolutely insane and radical.
That press
But
conference was really wild, which I did watch. By the way, also, it just is so it's absurd that she was delivering this message to a bunch of reporters, ostensibly meant for the other heads of agencies that you should be talking to,
right.
Russ Vought.
Well, I
It
mean,
was
it wasn't
really
even heads of
strange.
agencies. It was like the director of a Meals on Wheels program in
Right.
Arizona should call Russ
That too.
Vought and say, "Yeah, we're not
Yeah.
woke, we're not using DEI, and you should give us our money." And as if it's a return to this sort of system of supplication that is what Trump really wants to put in place, where he has authoritarian power to dictate virtually everything the federal government does. So, but I think this is the important point because I think it's become lost because sometimes these things happen and there's a big fight and Trump rescinds the policy or OMB rescinds the policy and Democrats think they win and they move on, right? This fight is not over. There are things inherently in the executive order. For example, the executive order called Unleashing American Energy says that disbursements of so-called Green New Deal policies that are energy related on the Inflation Reduction Act and in the infrastructure law, should be paused for a period that's longer than the pause that is allowed in the Impoundment Control Act. And so that is an impoundment. That is a problem. Things like the electric vehicle charging program that was in the infrastructure law and other things are not being money is not being spent on them right now. To the extent that money hasn't already gotten out the door on those programs, under the Biden administration. But there are certainly programs that are being impounded right now. Another example are foreign aid programs. The State Department has put a pause on most foreign aid programs. They rolled that back partially this week to say that humanitarian aid is an exemption to that, but that doesn't mean that every program is being allowed to go through and go forward. So there are impoundments happening right now, and that is deliberate. It is designed to pick this fight that will ultimately rise to the Supreme Court. And when the Supreme Court hears it, one of its justices will be hearing a case whose legal architect is his best friend.
Right. Well, and Peltola's connections to Clarence Thomas, I think, and just the world that Russ Vought and him.
Not Peltola, not Mary Peltola, but
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
Paletta. Yes.
Paletta, sorry. Paletta. It does just raise the question as well that if they know something that we maybe don't about the leanings of, the conservative Supreme Court, that they would want to test the boundaries this much right out of the gate just to see how far they can, get, or if they maybe are convinced that this doesn't seem as flagrantly illegal to the court as it, kind of does to a bunch of other legal experts or the
Yeah, I think the term used, test the boundaries, is really critical because I think that's what's going on throughout this sort of early period of the second Trump term. They are seeing where the weak spots are in the bureaucracy. They're seeing where the weak spots are within the government and pushing on those to see if they give way. And if there is pushback, maybe they step off for a minute. I think that's a broad question. As to whether they have inside information about this or not, I think that Trump folks are just as overtly confident about their birthright citizenship beliefs. They just have this sort of pose that, yes, the Supreme Court will definitely do everything that Trump says. And I think that's sort of a deliberate pose, whether or not the Supreme Court will actually comply or not. Now, they certainly have some reason to believe the Supreme Court will comply, right? Because uh, it's now a 6-3 court. Trump put 3 of those members on that court. It's a more conservative court than it was during the first Trump term, and the first Trump term did help out Trump a fair bit. Uh, and, look at the recent rulings around immunity, presidential immunity, and some of the other things. They have certainly reason to believe that whatever they throw up to the Supreme Court will get rubber stamped. Whether that is actually true or not remains to be seen. And I don't know what you think about it, but I think that certain of these orders, certain of these attempts, the really radical ones, give the Supreme Court an opportunity to show alleged independence from the Trump administration by saying, no, you can't do, birthright citizenship is legal under the 14th Amendment, and we're not going to change that. And it makes John Roberts look good to his establishment buddies. And indeed, the
Right.
Lever News put out this week that in the 1980s, John Roberts took a position when he was working inside the government that seemed to agree that Congress has the primary authority in terms of the spending power vis-a-vis the executive. So
Well,
there certainly are clues that the Supreme Court won't go as far as the Trump team thinks they will. But I think the way that Trump operates is that he just has this blind confidence, and sometimes it convinces people.
right. So this does coincide with, I think, a related issue. I mean, I don't want to go too far afield here, but this was just one of
Mhm.
my main questions about this. So, in terms of how the court might rule on essentially this assertion of impoundment power, and
Yeah,
which would mean a pretty radical expansion of the administrative, state, this unitary executive. We just
yeah,
had a huge Supreme Court ruling over the summer on what's called the Chevron
yeah,
deference. And that seems to, the ruling that the court had, which is that the administrative agencies and departments do not have this, writ that they've asserted to
right,
interpret kind of a little bit more expansively the laws set to them by Congress. They struck down that Chevron deference principle, and that would seem to suggest that the court does, in terms of their, jurisprudence philosophy, have some view that, Congress does have the power, of the purse and, can set kind of standards that the administrative state can't overstep. So I mean, it would be really interesting to see how that lines up. I don't know if you have, any theories about, these just
well,
two different
there
wings
there
of
you go
the
again,
judicial
looking for
movement.
consistency in
Well,
conservative legal doctrine. So
right.
yeah, I mean, you hit on something very, very important. So just this past year, the court essentially said, no, executive agencies, you cannot reinterpret what Congress says and expect to get the benefit of the doubt. So here, what is being said is that actually, no, you should give us, the executive, more authority. Just at the
Right.
time when they took away authority from the executive. The difference is that in Chevron deference, they took away authority from the executive branch to give it to the judiciary, right? It said, no, we judges are going to interpret the laws that Congress makes, not you, the executive. The difference here is that what is being asked for is, in this case, is like just take away the authority from Congress and give it to the executive entirely. Not to get it's not a question of where the courts rule weigh in on that specifically. So there is
That's
a
interesting.
slight difference there.
Yeah, no,
Um,
no, we'll see. Yeah.
yeah. So I mean that's really the whole thing on impoundment, and it's going to be a story that we're going to hear about until the Supreme Court weighs in on it, and maybe even after that, because in the first term, as I said, OMB showed itself very willing to take these very radical stances to try to delay spending. Sometimes they would call it programmatic delays. They said, "Oh no, this has nothing to do with impoundment. These are just programmatic delays. Just anything they can do to stop directives from Congress." I mean, the other question is, what's Congress going to actually give them? Will they have to stop as many things? At least in the next 2 years, because obviously this Congress is lining up very, very much with the Trump administration. So,
Right.
I mean, I think it's a very interesting thing that we'll see move on. I want to get now to what you were working on this week in one of your last, if not your last, piece for us. And it involved this sort of under the radar fight in Congress, in the new Congress, involving labor law. So why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I think to kind of just set this up. So, at the inauguration, I'm sure, most people kind of saw the news that, Trump had standing behind him the top executives, heads of all the major tech companies from Silicon Valley. And, that's a relationship that's been kind of developing even, before the election. You have Elon Musk, one of his big backers, um, and all of the kind of major heads, Bezos, Zuckerberg, head of Google. They've all kind of warmed up to him, and they're trying to sort of influence the new administration. And really, by all indications, I think the Trump White House seems pretty receptive to that. But it does set up this big clash with the fact that the coalition base that Trump won the popular vote with in the election does include it includes a huge amount of working class voters who came out for a Republican presidential candidate in just much higher numbers than we've seen in past election cycles. And there are conflicting interests there. There are different wings of the party. There's the kind of more tech business friendly one and this kind of more populist one. And where this is really going to where this divide I think is really going to come out is on a whole set of labor questions that will be, before Congress and the Trump administration over the next 4 years. We're seeing the kind of early, I would say, jockeying position of these two camps. So this past week, Josh Hawley, senator from Missouri, who is, one of the kind of more labor-friendly Republicans. There's really only a few of them. He's been working on this labor framework with the Teamsters Union and their president Sean O'Brien, and he's now circulating a draft proposal of a bill, and it would actually strengthen labor law by closing this big loophole that I've written about, which is that if a new union wins an election, there's actually not that much in the law that can really swiftly force an employer to actually come to the bargaining table to sign a first contract.
Right.
One of the Amazon unions in Staten Island's faced this problem, the Starbucks unions, lots of others. So his law would, force employers to come to the table in a certain period of time. And at the same time as Hawley's circulating this bill, the actual Republican chair of the help committee that oversees labor issues, pensions, benefits, and that sort. He has a very different idea of what he wants the committee to do. He announced his whole priorities for this Congress and the committee, and he wants the top labor priority to be this proposal called portable benefits, and it's basically to serve independent contractors and freelancers who don't get a lot who don't get employer benefits, that they could have some setup and arrangement where they would have like an individual account that multiple employers that they work for might, pay into. It would go with them, over the course of their working career, which, maybe sounds kind of straightforward, but there is, a whole other kind of dimension to this. It coincides with this big fight that the rideshare apps and Uber and Lyft, the kind of, gig companies, have actually been pushing for these portable benefits as a kind of way to basically enshrine the classification status of their workers who are classified as contractors, not full-time employees, which denies them all of the benefits you would already get as a worker, social security, unemployment insurance, access to healthcare, even just minimum wage, right to unionize, all this other stuff. So Uber and Lyft and the other apps have been going to a number of state legislatures for a couple of years now and pushing similar versions of this portable benefits bill as a, sort of a kind of compromise, saying we'll give some concessions to our workers. We'll let them have we'll do a stipend for them to pay for health insurance on the open market or retirement savings, but you have to establish that they are contractors. And they're doing this because there's all kinds of regulatory scrutiny on these companies right now. State level, there are all these misclassification lawsuits. Federally, the Department of Labor set a really kind of important rule that would close some of these loopholes in the classification of workers as contractors that would directly hit rideshare drivers. Uber and Lyft have been dragging that rule through court for the last several years because this is really their bread and butter. And at the state level, they've had some successes, and this is going to kind of keep developing. But it's a very clear indication, I think, that Cassie wants to take up this industry-backed bill and sort of cloaked in the language that this is, the new conservative working class party, and we're gonna, throw a bone to labor, but it's really, sort of far from that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think everything you want to know about the sort of conservative, we're a workers' party now pose, you can take from the fact that both the general counsel of the NLRB, Jennifer Bruzzo, and one of its commissioners, board members, Gwynne Wilcox, were both fired this week. Fired under very dicey, I mean, at least for Wilcox, under very dicey legality, which is also intended to pick a fight, by the way. They want to basically turn all employees into at-will employees of the federal government that can be fired by the president at any time, including those on independent commissions, which is what the NLRB is. What we have right now, because of these firings, is a situation where there are only two members on the five-member board of the NLRB, and that is not a quorum. And under Supreme Court precedent, the NLRB can now not issue any rulings that filter up to it. Administrative law judges and regional NLRB commissions can still put rulings together. But the example here, the analogy that I would make is this is like you don't have an appeals court, but everyone can still appeal. So let's say there's a union election and the regional NLRB says, the workers won the union election. And the company says, no, they didn't. There was this problem and that problem, and we're going to appeal. Well, now there's no appeals court. The NLRB it is unable to resolve disputes. And as a result, that will just stall out until such time as there's a quorum on the NLRB.
Right.
So, here we see, I mean, at one level, Trump and his allies are trying to pick a fight to make sure that, independent commissions are loyal to them. But at another level, they're basically deleting all labor law in the United States indefinitely. And that tells you everything you need to know, I think, about where the administration and where Republicans more broadly are positioned in terms of labor rules.
Right.
Hawley is an
Because
outlier, even if you can call him an outlier, an extreme outlier on this whole business.
Right, and because the example you just explained of basically not having an appeals court, it can equally work the other way, right? If a union wants to also contest an outcome of an election, and by the way, there's a big one coming up in North Carolina at a big Amazon, at a major Amazon facility, warehouse that's going to be this month, in February, and if they want to contest some of the conditions, of that election, if that happened, it would run into the same issue. Whole host of other cases that are before the NLRB are gonna, now be paused indefinitely as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, unfair labor practices and a whole host of things. But yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing here is a move of a very successful strategy that Uber, Lyft, DoorDash had at the state level, and an attempt to put that in at the federal level. And whether or not they'll be able to do so is pretty much entirely dependent on a small group of Democrats who could
Right.
potentially go along with what seems to be a universally accepted policy idea. My remembrance of the portable benefits policy is that it was a Cassidy Mark Warner operation. I think
Yep.
Warner is very
Mark
much
Warner's been
involved
the
in it.
he's been the longest sponsor,
Right.
of that bill. Yeah.
So he
And
gets
over
five
few
or six of his
Democrats.
buddies, from a party who just, a few months ago had a presidential candidate whose brother-in-law and top advisor was the chief legal officer of Uber.
Yeah.
You could easily see this put into place, which would effectively, embed misclassification of workers into these particular gig economy relationships,
Right.
which would be, and you've outlined and explained why that would be not so great for workers.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think the Cassidy Republican strategy here, right, is that they get to pick this bill that already has lots of industry support, would maybe be bipartisan and get probably a handful of Democrats to come along. And even, some of the labor groups are a little bit split on this. It's kind of a major divide in some regards, in the labor movement about, what do you do about this growing share of the
Right.
workforce, that are
Right, Luke. There was
contractors?
an issue in Massachusetts involving
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah, and that
An initiative. Why don't you tell us about that?
yeah, well, right, and it kind of ties directly into, this strategy that's been ongoing for a number of years by Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, other apps. I wish there was some. I never have a slick, all-encompassing term for. I just the app companies. But anyways, they uh, they went to Massachusetts, and there was a giant misclassification lawsuit that the then AG, now governor, brought against them. And, they essentially said, if you bring this case to court, and the result likely of that case would have been that they would have classified all of their drivers in the state of Massachusetts as full-time employees, which is what they want to avoid at all costs, because it comes along with then all the other, benefits and minimum wage that you have to provide workers. They said basically, we'll run a ballot initiative just like we had in California a few years ago, pump $20 million into it, and we will just get a law that says these are actually, contractors. And the AG's office said, well, that would be the worst, outcome. At least this was their rationale. We'll settle, and we won't go to court. You have to, Uber and Lyft, you have to abide by, a new set of conditions for your workers. More or less what this entailed is a, kind of baseline minimum, pay that each driver will get for, an hour that they work. There's a lot of complications with this that I reported on previously. A lot of drivers say that the baseline they agree to just doesn't meaningfully raise the floor for what they're already making for a lot of their drives. But another component was Uber and Lyft backed a ballot measure that would have actually allowed drivers to form a sectoral level bargaining unit in the state. So this is not based on federal labor law. This would have been an amendment to the state labor law. So they have a different arrangement. But again, the kind of condition is that their drivers are still independent contractors even though they'd be able to get this exemption to organize as a bargaining unit. The reason for that is because if you're contractors, technically organizing is considered, collusion under law.
Right.
It's one of the big flaws of it. And that ballot measure actually passed, and it passed because, in large part, it had the backing of the SEIU union, major labor union. And SEIU's logic was that this is a meaningful step forward for our drivers in some regards. And the counter to that is you got this law passed. You can form a sectoral bargaining unit. You're going to spend a decade, if not more, just trying to negotiate with the company to get benefits that all other workers are already guaranteed and have been for almost, in some cases, 100 years, that
Right.
work have fought for. And that's the kind of big tension here in the labor movement. You get these new benefits, portable benefits, retirement savings, or even the sectoral unit. It sounds nice, but does that really meaningfully move the goalposts
Right.
forward for this pretty precarious, class of workers? And yeah, we'll see how this all shakes out the state level in Washington.
All right, great. We have about 10, 15 minutes left. Couple things I want to roll through. Number one, as long as we're talking about workers, I mean, one of the other big stories I think of this early Trump administration is the kind of terrorizing of the federal workforce. So we've done a couple stories on that. One is this, I hesitate to call it a buyout offer, but this offer that the Office of Personnel Management, which apparently has been taken over by Elon Musk and some acolytes of his, put forward to over 2 million federal workers, saying that you could go on deferred resignation and you won't have to come into the office. You won't have a particular workload. It's unclear. I mean, there are no guarantees there, so it's a little weird on that point. But after September 30th of this year, you would be off the clock, and you would get all your benefits and pay up until that point. It seems that the president has no authority to do that. Neither does Elon Musk, even though he apparently was elected our president. And I think federal workers are pushing back pretty strongly on this whole idea. The other thing that we reported, I think we're among the first to report, is this attack on probationary workers. This is workers with 1 year or less in the federal government. They were all sent an email after agencies were told to compile lists of all of the employees who had 1 year or less in civil service. And this email, it was a really strange email because really all the email said is, you are a probationary employee, as if the employee didn't already know that. But what it articulated is, you have fewer civil service protections and we have the right to fire you at any time. Just wanted you to know. So thanks a lot. And that's true. I mean, there are fewer civil service protections for probationary employees. They can pretty much be fired at will. And it represents about 200,000 plus federal workers, at least the last time that it was examined. And so there's the possibility here that a lot of the reductions in force that clearly Elon and Doge really want can be done through just firing the first people in, or the last people in, I should say.
It seems like that class of civil servants who are on a probation period are really the group they're perhaps targeting the most with the so-called buyout. So it's like a terror campaign, and then we'll give you
Yeah.
this opening to usher you out the door voluntarily.
Yeah, it's basically saying we're going to
Yeah.
make your life miserable. And by
Yeah.
the way, if you don't want that, you can take the buyout. There are also other
Carrot and
high
sticks.
level, there are also lots of other high level employees in policymaking positions where there was an executive order to change their designation to make them easier to fire. There have been these policy arguments. One of the highest ranking non-political officials at the Treasury Department announces retirement. The head of the
Right.
Census Bureau, the head of the FAA quit in a dispute with Elon
Yeah.
Musk. We should mention that because of
Yeah.
the DPA plane crash that happened this week. There are a whole host of sort of personality clashes or policy clashes that are going on that are taking out some of the most valued members of the federal bureaucracy who are just simply leaving in order to, not be terrorized, to
Yeah.
not be harassed for the next 4 years. Most of those people are senior enough that they could probably get a much better job in the private sector, making a lot more money, but they were sort of dedicated public servants who now are being told, get the hell out of here. And
Yeah.
it's really about a rework, sort of a remaking of the federal government workforce in the image of Donald Trump, and with all the loyalty that
Yeah.
accords.
Great. I mean, a great comparison that I heard, and this is right up our alley. Um, so there's a great subreddit where a lot of federal workers have just kind
Hmm.
of post. There's some leaks. They'll post, stories and such. Um,
Yeah,
and one of them said, basically, this must be what it feels like to go through a hostile takeover at, maybe the largest company. Like that's kind of, I think, sort of the vibe. If you're in one of these agencies, is it's like a big new company bought you out, and they want to kick out the old staff, and they're trying to either
yeah.
make your life, hell, or things aren't, running properly. There are all these changes, and it's just, it's total
Or
mayhem.
to just universalize it even more, it's like when a new landlord takes over
Yeah.
your apartment building and they try to harass the hell out of you so they can kick, you can kick yourself out and they can
Right.
raise the rent. So I think everyone's
Right.
experienced this at some level. And in fact, the email that was sent with this sort of fake buyout offer, the title of the email was "A Fork in the Road." It was basically saying, this is what we're going to do for the federal workforce. And if you don't like it, get out. And that was also the title of Elon Musk's first email to employees at Twitter. And so this is clearly a Musk
Really similar
operation.
language, like all up
Very,
and down.
very
Like,
much
yeah.
so. Very
Yeah.
much so. So yeah, this is that kind of operation.
Yeah, and
Definitely.
maybe on this point, this is just a little bit. This is somewhat more of a side story. Not that it's unimportant, but at OPM, Office of Personal Management, there's a whole host of things that are going on, but they seem to be really the touch.
Which, by the way, we should say is like sort of the government's HR
Yeah,
department.
yeah, yeah.
And it is a completely non-political, non partisan
Right.
kind of workforce, and historically has been right up until 2 weeks ago.
Right. And this is sort of, I think, the epicenter of where, Doge and the other, Trump people are starting to install their loyalists to shake things up. So the first several new hires there, they've pushed some people voluntarily left, or some were pushed out. The new director's chief of staff is
Yeah,
is a woman called Amanda Scales, who has a very sparse resume, mainly consisting of working for the AI division at X for
yeah.
Elon Musk. She was doing like HR at, Uber before then. Suspiciously, very little information about her online. The other employee that they hired is like a 21-year-old kid who worked at Palantir, which is a defense contractor that Peter Thiel started. And then there's
So you
a
don't
bunch
you
of
don't
other.
like hiring people just out of college?
Well,
That's a problem for you?
well, I wasn't given that option. There's another kid who's like out of high school. There's a crazy
Yeah,
Wired story that was
yeah.
published about all these kind of young software engineers from the tech world that are now
Yeah.
operating this big epicenter of the Trump agenda.
And just to extend that forward, it seems like the
Yeah,
next agency that's subject to this takeover is the General Services Administration, and
right.
among other things, they handle procurement policies within the government, and they also basically control the government's real estate portfolio. And this has been
Yeah.
a big initiative of Doge to sell off excess surplus property, which actually, we'll probably have some more reporting on that later because that could trigger some real issues in the commercial real estate market if there's a fire sale on federal buildings all of a sudden.
Interesting.
But one last thing I wanted to bring to your attention and get your comments on it, because I know you follow the monopoly beat quite a bit, and we did see the very first
Never heard of it.
merger challenge of the second Trump administration, and it came very quickly and very early. And I'm wondering if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, okay, I think just to say some of the details of this merger maybe are not, it's not like the sexiest thing in the world. It's pretty important. It's sort of like office level equipment and software, but it's
Yeah.
more a little bit the fact that this was the first action out of the gates from the Antitrust division, DOJ under Trump. It's a little bit more of a meta story.
Yeah,
So,
so let's talk
yeah,
about it. It was Hewlett Packard Enterprises
yeah,
and a thing called Juniper Networks. And yeah,
right,
they do sort of back office stuff for mainly for Wi-Fi routers and things like
right,
that.
right.
And there are three companies that control about two-thirds of this industry, and this would make it two. I mean,
Yeah,
it's a
it's
three
very
to two
straightforward.
merger. It's and but there was some question as to whether or not the Trump administration, even in these sort of
Right.
obvious cases, would take the bait and actually enforce the law. And this, at least on this particular one, it seems that they will.
Yeah, and again, just in terms of the dynamics for the case. So these are just direct head-to-head competitors for this kind of back-end office, wireless equipment. And um, Juniper was forcing Hewlett Packard, these are the two companies merging. They were
Yeah.
forcing Hewlett Packard to drop their prices for
Right.
this equipment to a bunch of businesses. And Hewlett Packard was, really pissed about these discounts, and they had a whole internal campaign that DOJ, seemed to uncover investigating this merger that was literally called like, kill Juniper, right? And so
Right.
they were trying to, go at them really hard, and then they just decided, well, we'll just buy out this kind of, this burdensome company that's making us lower our prices. It seems like a very pretty straightforward, case, and yeah, it's an indication that even if this is, very kind of, baseline challenging mergers, that they're DOJ is sending, I think somewhat of a signal that they're not going to completely whole scale, reverse the cancer reign at DOJ antitrust.
Yeah,
Maybe.
and I think that's important. So
Yeah.
it's something certainly that we'll keep on. All right. Well, look, we're down to the final moments here. And Luke, I want to thank you again for all of your contributions as a writing fellow. One of the best parts of my job is working with fellows in this program. I should say that we're going to be replacing Luke, and you can go to prospect.org/job. If you or anyone you know is sort of at the entry level of their journalism career, and maybe I'll ask for a solicited testimonial as to the benefits of that program from you, Luke.
Yeah.
Um,
Happy to oblige. Yeah. It's been a great week.
um, yeah. So thanks a lot. We will be back next week with another member of our staff here on the Prospect Weekly Roundup. We'll have video of this episode up on the website later today. And, we do this every week at 12:30 Eastern, 9:30 Pacific. And that's about it. We'll
Yeah.
keep documenting the Trump administration
Any,
at doc. prospect.org?
Me and Jim Acosta leaving the same week, you know? It's funny how that works out. Yeah.
Well, we did
On
offer you to
stints.
stay, but you would only be able to do these at midnight Eastern.
Yeah.
And for some reason, you decided that was offensive to you, so
Yeah.
you didn't want to do it.
I got the
Uh,
buyout option. Yeah. Yeah.
Very good. Well, thanks again and good luck, and we'll see you down the road. And thanks to everybody else. Have a good rest
Yeah.
of your day.
See y'all.